Good morning, this is Nick Allen speaking. We're just waiting for a few more people to sign on. The broadcast is not meant to go live until midday, but we'll give it a couple more minutes. Thank you to those who have already signed on, and thank you for just being patient for a minute or two whilst we let the numbers increase. I'm pleased to say that we've got a fair number already signed on, so that's great. And as I say, give us a couple of minutes just to let the numbers build, and then Mike, who's sitting here with me, and I will start the presentation. And the first thing we'll do anyway is have a quick check to make sure that you can hear us effectively, and we'll ask you, I'll repeat this question in a minute, but I might as well say it now. But could you, if you can hear us, could you give us a yes, please, in the chat box or questions on the right-hand side? Thank you. Just say yes if you can hear us. I'm not sure we can do a great deal if you can't hear us. At this end, yes, I can hear you. Thank you. 2 people have said that, so that's great. We know that somebody's getting through and can hear us well, so that is great. Thank you for that. We're going to assume that everybody else can hear us as long as those can. Fantastic. If at any point you feel the sound quality is a problem, then do send us a message as well. It's quite difficult sometimes with these laptop microphones to quite know where to speak and make sure we're both heard equally. I'm going to start recording. I think it's doing that automatically. Yes, I'm pretty sure it's doing. This session is being recorded. Right. So we've got a good number of, let me just have a little look. Yeah, we've got a good number of people have joined us, so that is great. I think. Well, we've got at least 50% of the people that have signed up, which is a great start. Fantastic. So thank you very much. I think we should sort of move into the webinar. My name's Nick Allen, and I'm hosting this webinar on behalf of MDV Consulting and Talent Innovations. We are recording this webinar, which we will send out to those people that were unable to attend at this time. So because of that, I won't mention anybody's names on the webinar, so we want to keep a high level of confidentiality in this process. So I hope that's okay with everybody. We're not going to mention any names, but I'm very pleased to see that we've got a wide number of people now joining us from a variety of industries, both public sector and private industries. So thank you very much. We will be sending out this recording at the end of the webinar. Should last about an hour, that's our plan, and we will, at the end of the webinar again, we will mail out a copy of the slides that you have in front of, or you have on screen. We will also send out a copy of our VUCA 360 report, and so you can have a look at that as well. And there are some links to articles on the MDV website, which will be available for you through the slides, at the end of the slides. And we're also going to talk a little bit about, on a first come, first served basis, 5 copies of a recent book called Upgrade, Building Your Capacity for Complexity. And we'll give those to the first 5 people who email us and answer some questions at the end of the webinar to give us some helpful feedback. Right, now I'd like to introduce, I need to get the slide system working. I'd like to introduce to you Mike Vesey, who is Managing Partner of MDV Consulting, a leadership and talent consultancy operating internationally. MDV serves an array of clients, including professional services, food and drink manufacturers, financial services, regulators and transportation. Welcome, Mike. Can I ask you to say a few words about MDV?
Thanks, Nick, and thank you everyone for joining the call. There were some familiar names that I saw signing up, and I'm delighted to be doing today's webinar in collaboration with Talent Innovations and Elva. Elva and I, in fact, worked together, as some of you on the call will know, back in the day at SHL. But for the last 10 years, I've been the managing partner of MDV Consulting. We provide clients with assessment and development services. So that's assessment, whether for selection, internal promotion, talent diagnostic type assessment. We do development at the one-to-one, the team and cohort level, and we also provide clients with tools and processes to aid their self-development or self-sufficiency in assessment and development practices. And as Nick said, we've got quite an eclectic mix of clients. The other thing I just wanted to say by way of introduction, how do we come to be here today? Because in the last 5 years, we've really been exploring the world of adult development, or vertical development as it's become more popularly known, and that was really in response to a client inquiry 5 years back now, and I met that client this morning actually for breakfast first thing, and they said to us, Mike, our tools and technologies are fine for leaders who can run the business, but we need to transform our business, and that inquiry has started a journey that I've made and MDV has made into the world of adult development theory, and want to share some of that exploration that we've done with you today.
So by way of a brief introduction to Talent Innovations, we provide bespoke and premium 360-degree tools and services to help bring intelligence, data and thoughts into our clients' world. I've been working with Elva and the team at Talent Innovation for 25 years. So we've had a little note. I'm not seeing the slider. Have you slides? Slides. You're not showing. Oh, right. Apparently we're not seeing the slides. So I'm going to hit the button. There we go. I've been carefully going through the slides, but I'd forgotten to switch them on. So my apologies for that. You haven't missed anything other than a picture of Mike and me, which I expect you can live without.
You can see how I've aged.
Yes. So I'm working with Talent Innovations. I'm an executive coach and use 360 a lot in my work and have done for many years. So I'm just going to move us forward. Thank you. So our aims for the workshop today is to discuss and explore what HR and talent development professionals can do to help their leaders adapt and grow in this time of uncertainty and disruption. And Mike will draw on current research and findings and new concepts of leadership to provide practical insights to you. So we'll give you some tips, we'll take you through the report, and we'll talk through the models on which a lot of this thinking or our report and processes are developed. Mike, would you like to expand a little bit on what you see as the key takeaways or points from this webinar?
Yes, thanks, Nick. So we'll start by just saying a little bit about the sort of disruption and complexity and uncertainty that certainly our clients tell us they're experiencing out there in the marketplace, and that really provides the context for why we think we need different approaches to how we assess and develop leaders, because we are living in a time of dislocation. The requirements of the day job are outstripping people's capability to keep up. And therefore adult development or vertical development gives us a way of growing that capability to match the demands that are before us. So we'll share some of that thinking with you, and that will provide a segue into the 360 tool that we've developed with Talent Innovations, which articulates how then we can support leaders to develop these capabilities that are aimed at developing their underlying sense-making or meaning-making. And we'll come back to that phraseology time and time again, because this is moving us beyond a world that many of us, certainly I grew up in terms of traits and behavioural competencies, to really look inside a person and say, how are they making sense of the world around them, looking at their thinking, how they relate to one another, and how people manage themselves. So quite a different set of capabilities from the behavioural competencies that were more trait-based or intelligence-based that many of us grew up with.
Right, I think we'll start with a poll. And the question is on the screen, but I'm now going to launch the poll and ask our participants if they'd be kind enough just to read the question and rate where they think their organisation is.
And if you're a freelance consultant or you're a coach, you might want to think about a client organisation maybe that you're working with at the moment.
Great, I can see that we've got some results now, so just give you another couple of seconds in case you're hesitating, and I will poll complete, close the poll, and I'll share the results. There we go. So to what extent do you feel your organisation is being disrupted or facing unprecedented complexity compared with previous years? Mike, 57% or nearly 2/3 think to a significant amount.
Yes, well, I think maybe the good news, given we're in the middle of a general election campaign that seems to be going quite bonkers, no one thinks it's life-threatening, but 57% are saying a significant amount, and a further 38% are saying some. So only, I guess that's one person has said not much at all. Maybe you can tell us afterwards if there's any secret to that. Now, of course, there are some industries and there are some jobs in some of our client organisations where people are saying, no, it's business as usual. And therefore, if that's what your clients are telling you, or that's your organisation, then maybe you don't need adult development and this questionnaire particularly to help you. But for the other 95% of people who have said some or significant amount, that certainly would accord with what our clients are telling us, that they're noticing there is greater complexity, uncertainty, volatility and disruption in to their business models and in their marketplace.
Mike, so let's just explore a little bit more what we mean by disruption.
Yeah, so I mean, very often if I'm starting a session with clients, I might ask them, in what ways is your business or being disrupted? And you get a variety of different responses, clearly depending on the industry and depending on the sector, but you notice some commonality across industries and across sectors. So some of the things you typically hear will be things like digitalization, the democratization of data and data flows within in organizations. We hear things about the changing nature of the workforce and intergenerational workforces and different expectations that people have from the workforce. And then some of the more specific things that some of our clients are telling us at the moment, we hear regulatory changes, and that might affect a client, and we'll look at a case study a bit later on, where the introduction of the sugar tax has really affected one of our clients who produces fizzy soft drinks, and how they've had to respond to that sugar tax. Regulation can also affect things like employment and products and services that people can offer. We also work with a number of financial services clients, and they're noticing the growth of fintech organisations, small, nimble, increasingly online, mobile-enabled companies that are stealing market share. So new market entrants coming in, disrupting quite established, very traditional businesses and their business model, and usually doing it in a way that is much cheaper and much more agile than the traditional established bank or insurance company has been able to do. And if you're dialing in from the UK, I guess the overlay that affects a lot of us is Brexit. What will be the regulatory regime come the end of January? Well, we just don't know. And if you're in an industry that is regulated, if you're in an industry that is buying your raw materials from abroad, if you're in an industry that has relied on EU labour up to this point, all of that is having a significant disruptive influence on your business. And the problem is we just don't know. In the past, perhaps we could kind of extrapolate or peer into the future and say, well, what mitigating moves could I make? But with many of these trends, they are coming at us so fast, and we're needing to just pivot like we've never pivoted before. And that makes it very difficult to plan ahead with any degree of certainty whatsoever. And I think that's where we get this concept of VUCA. I'm sure that's an acronym that some of you have heard. It maybe has even become now a bit hackneyed or overused. It was originally coined by the US military, moving from fighting a conventional campaign in Iraq to a guerrilla insurgency campaign, but it's increasingly been taken up by the corporate world, and VUCA standing for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and we'll probably use that term throughout today's webinar.
And I think Brexit is probably the best example one could come up with of a context or a situation that we all find ourselves in, leading to massive uncertainty if you're a business, and with that, the complexity and how does one prepare for that. And so this is not really about going back to an older time that's more stable, but this is about creating or developing the fitness in your organisation to be able to rapidly respond and adjust to uncertainty and unpredictable outcomes. It was interesting, I read recently in an RSA, Royal Society of Arts poll, that only 15% of parliamentarians think that government is doing enough to prepare for a changing world. So, I mean, I think this is a universal challenge, and it's not just a domestic challenge in this country, it's a global challenge.
And I think therein lies an issue, given that we've traditionally looked to leaders, parliamentarians to chart a way through. If parliamentarians and the government don't know where we're going, what hope is there for the rest of us maybe?
And it creates even higher levels of uncertainty, because as of December the 12th, there may be a new philosophy behind a regulatory regime around the size of governments, around all of those things. So anything could happen. So it's a nightmare for those of you that are out in business. Mike, would you take us a little bit through this, because we want to connect why adult development and the theories that have developed about adult development over many years are relevant to where we find ourselves today in this context.
Yeah, thank you. So it's because of this changing environment and this disconnect between the environment we see out there and the capabilities of leaders, teams, organisations, you could even say humanity, to keep up with that complexity, that I think we're in a time of dislocation. And I think there is a pattern throughout humanity where we have seen the inventions of technology or particular historical events which have created a disconnect, where people have said, or societies have felt, we are in over our heads. And that's a phrase from Bob Kegan, one of these key authors. If you can see in small print on that timeline, you'll see Bob Kegan featuring there quite prominently. So because the complexity out there is outstripping our capability to keep up with it, we can no longer predict with any certainty what might be the competencies that one might need to navigate that complexity. And therefore, we've seen a shift away from behavioural competencies to really thinking about capability and how people make sense of their environment and how they manage themselves and manage their relationship and organise their thinking. Now, this isn't new theory here. This comes from the sort of positive developmental school of psychology, and some of these theorists, people like Erikson and Piaget, if you remember back to your undergraduate psychology course were writing back in the 1950s. So this isn't a new movement within the psychological fraternity, but I think these ideas are of their time now. And what these theories all share in common, and sometimes making the links between them is a little bit complicated, is that they say that adults, in the same way that we see children moving through discernible stages of development, that we don't stop developing when we reach 18 or 21, we continue to grow in the way that we make meaning or we make sense of our surroundings throughout our adult lifespan. Now, some people will pause or plateau in their development, but it is possible to continue to grow throughout the life cycle of one's adulthood. Now, in terms of explaining the theory, I often use two analogies to help us here, to explain the difference between how does adult development, or vertical development as it's become popularly known as, differ from the skills, knowledge, content type development that we used to do, and that perhaps we've grown up with. And I think the analogy of the water glasses here is the first one, and I've got a second one as well. So horizontal development, traditional learning, is really about adding more knowledge, skills, more competence to a person. And that works up to a point. But if your leaders, your clients are already saying, I'm in over my head, my glass is overflowing, pouring more content into an already full vessel is not going to help a person to grow and meet the complexity of the situation out there. So what vertical development is about is creating a bigger vessel, more capacity to lean into or face the complexity of the world out there. So it's not to do with content, skills and knowledge. It is about expanding the vehicle or the vessel to lean into that complexity. The second analogy that I often use, which I'll share with you, is one of the smartphone, and I find this really resonates with clients as well. Most of us all have a smartphone now. This is the difference between putting more apps on your smartphone and upgrading the operating system. Very easy to put an app on there, you get more functionality from the smartphone, and it probably takes you a second or two to add a new app. If you want to upgrade the operating system of the phone, then that takes quantum, there's a different quantum in terms of the time it takes to upgrade the operating system, but the whole system, the whole phone then works more effectively. We haven't just added more functionality. So hopefully those two analogies are useful for you. If you really want to see those analogies used, there's some good papers by Nick Petrie from the Centre for Creative Leadership, and he uses this idea of horizontal versus vertical very well there. So go to the CCL site or ping us afterwards, and we can send you copies of those. And those are short papers that you can use with clients very easily to explain the difference between traditional learning and vertical development.
I'm going to apologise a little bit for this slide. It's not one that we expect you to read, but it's one drawn from MDV's training programmes, or some of the programmes that they run, perhaps I should say development programmes, to help people. And Mike, explain why these case studies are useful in drawing out the different stages people are at in their ability to make sense of the world.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Nick. I think we're not expecting you to read them, but when you get the slides you can have a look. But these are 4 vignettes from people who all attended the same meeting. And I think sometimes when we talk about adult development theory or vertical development, it can quickly get into the realms of psychobabble. So what these 4 vignettes show is that 4 characters attended the same meeting, and I often use this example to share with an audience and say, rank order these 4 in order of their development. who is perhaps earlier in their development and who might be later. And I've never yet had a group working with totally mixed audiences, line managers, not just HR people and psychologists, who don't get these four in the right order. So although I've just showed you a slide with lots of theory of stage models of development, this is something that is often very recognizable, and we often use terms like, well, X is wiser or is more sophisticated in their thinking or than another person. And this is really just putting into words what that wisdom, that practical wisdom, often looks like. And if you read those passages, I suspect you'll equally be able to rank order them. So this is a very easily discernible thing, but very often it's kept hidden as part of a person. What we're doing here is we're bringing this sense-making frame out into the open, and we're giving a label to it in the way that perhaps it's been hidden in the past.
So it's not a dark art or a black art, is it? This is behaviours and habits and patterns that are easily observable, but you need a framework to understand how to organise what you're observing. And I think that is what was the inspiration behind developing the VUCA tool. Is that right?
It is, yes. Now what you've got here, of course, is four passages where the person themselves is saying what meaning they are making from this particular situation. And I think this is a nice illustration of the difference between meaning or sense making and what we might typically see in terms of behaviour from someone. So an example I often use is we see someone getting angry or frustrated. And if we only look at the surface level behaviour, we just see someone getting angry. What we don't know, and what these passages tell us here, is the thoughts and feelings that lie behind that behaviour. So I might look at a situation and something happens and I think, bloody hell, and I get angry, and you see anger, and it's an instinctive response. That's a world of difference from if I see a situation or something happens to me, and in a nanosecond I think, what are my options here? I could try explaining this once again to this person, but we've been through it 5 times already. I could do X, I could do Y, and I might reach the conclusion that actually, sod it, I'm going to have to do anger here. I've exhausted all my other possibilities, and therefore I do anger. I don't get angry, but I'm using anger here, or frustration, or any other strategy as a conscious tactic. And I think in that little example you can see there's a world of difference between someone just getting angry and someone using anger as a conscious or a deliberate strategy in terms of how they've made sense of the situation.
Well, let's go a little deeper and drill down into another model from a guy called Cynefin, or the model is named Cynefin, and this was one that you've used and developed or worked with to put some of that into a framework?
It is, Nick, yeah, and this provides a nice segue to the 360 instrument as well. So very good person who's become a very good friend of mine, Jennifer Garvey-Berger, who is a fantastic author in the field of adult development, introduced me to the Cynefin framework, and Dave Snowden, probably about 4 years ago now. Now the framework itself, Dave won't thank me for saying this, but is an adaptation of earlier work by Professor Ralph Stacey and his Stacey matrix. But this is a really useful frame for explaining the difference I find to leaders between a world in which they may have grown up and feel more comfortable, that's the world on the right hand side of this framework, the predictable world, which is more ordered, linear, where cause and effect are largely known, there's a repeatable pattern. If I do X, I can be fairly certain that Y is going to happen. I'm about to bake the family Christmas cake, I follow the family traditional recipe, it's fairly obvious, providing I stick to the recipe, the cake comes out time and time again. It's simple or obvious. If it was a bit more complicated and there was a bit more separation between the analysis that I needed to do and the result. Well, I might need to get some technical experts, but they would broadly be working to a similar recipe, working along a pathway to arrive at a solution. And that's the world that many of us have grown up in, and therefore our leadership responses are quite attuned to that way of working. The transition from complicated to complex, and these aren't hard lines here, that Dave calls them membrane, so there is some fluidity here, which is why they're drawn as sort of wavy lines rather than a hard 2x2. That transition from complicated to complex really does require a different set of leadership capabilities, and it is that transition from complicated to complex that the 360 tool that we've developed with Talent Innovations is specifically designed to help leaders with. So it's not a comprehensive model of capability or behaviour. It's specifically targeted at the capabilities needed to move from complicated to complex.
So we know, don't we, from our experience, that leaders fall back on their tried and tested patterns and habits. And so we're trying to, in a way, help talent development and leadership development professionals kickstart a different movement. Mm-hmm. And so can you just take us through a little bit to, this is the sort of distillation of what was on the previous slides into the model that is at the beginning of that kickstart process, that 360 process?
It is. So we've got 5 capabilities here, and as I said, it's not intended to be a comprehensive behavioural or competency framework. It's 5 capabilities to help leaders make that shift, navigate that shift from complicated to complex. And if we start at sort of 10 to the hour, promotes inquiry, what this... Oh, I'm going to come on and say a bit more detail about each of them individually. I'm ahead of myself. Yeah, so we move around from promotes inquiry, surfacing paradox, dilemmas, polarities, connecting people and ideas, nudging systems, and then we've got cultivating resilience at the heart. And maybe a little force, but for sort of, presentation purposes, we've mapped some of those to VUCA as well.
So there is a connection between volatility and promoting inquiry, and cultivating resilience is a sort of core capacity.
Yeah, it's a capability we think is at the heart of things. How do you keep your head when everyone else around you is losing theirs?
Well, let's go through these, as you said, Mike, in a little bit of more detail of them. So take us through these.
Yeah, and I think let's say why are these relevant. So the old paradigm of leaders operating in the traditional world would be leaders would have all of the answers. And if you think about some of the metaphor we use for leaders, it's the captain on the bridge, the pilot of the plane, the all-seeing, all-knowing, follow me, and creating followership. In a complex situation, cause and effect are unknown. Leaders do not have the answers. They are as blind to the future as any of the rest of us. And therefore they've got to unlearn some of that instinctiveness that says, I have to provide all of the answers and rally people behind me. And that can be quite threatening for leaders when they are aware that people are looking to them to provide the answers. And you see behaviours like leaders withdrawing or shutting themselves away in the corner office, and surveys then saying, our leaders aren't visible enough. Well, because the leaders don't have the answers anymore. So our response to that is to say, what leaders need to be doing is to be asking the right questions, not coming up with all of the answers, and noticing as they're inquiring some of their own pattern biases, prejudices. How can we get greater perspective taking? How can I start to truly empathise with other perspectives and step back with a degree of detachment or objectivity, perhaps from some of my traditional pattern biases? Surfacing dilemmas. So I think one of the core skills or capabilities of navigating a VUCA environment is to notice, is this a problem to be solved, or is it a dilemma or a polarity to be navigated? And the nature of a dilemma, of course, is that there's no right or wrong answer. Do we go left or do we go right? So typical polarities we hear in client systems are short-term versus long-term. Of course, if we don't focus on the short-term, we might not have a business for the long-term. But if we only focus on the short-term, we might be making things worse for the long-term. So the job of the leader there is to get the best of both. This is a both and thinking rather than an either or other dilemmas might be centralization versus localization, or empowerment versus control. So surfacing dilemmas and holding both ends of the polarity is a really key capability for the VUCA world. Now, connecting creatively, this is about both creating ideas across our more complex matrix structures, but also connecting people. Because we hear a lot when we consult with our clients about silo working. We've now got matrix structures. How do we get the flow of information across the organisation so we move from what this is showing at first glance, a sort of hub and spoke where the leader has to be at the centre of everything, to start to connect people in new ways. And the role of the leader there becomes creating the environment where people can start to talk with one another and work in a much more agile way, rather than information is sort of bottlenecked or is stored in certain systems that other people can't access. So the role of the leader there becomes the conductor by which ideas and people start to flow throughout the organisation. Now, nudging systems, this is an interesting one. If we buy the Cynefin framework that in the complex space, we're not quite sure what is cause and effect, the last thing we want to do is come up with a single silver bullet solution and go hell for leather with that single silver bullet solution, because we're not quite sure now whether this single silver bullet solution is actually the answer or not. It might be, but it might not. And that really requires a lot of unwiring of our past paradigms of what it means to project manage and be tenacious about a goal. So nudging systems is about treading gently. It's about blowing gently on the system and experimenting and designing safe to fail experiments in your client system to start to discern what patterns there might be between cause and effect. And often when I even mention the phrase safe to fail, I get a lot of pushback from people we work with, and they say, but Mike, we can't experiment in our system. We're a law firm. You know, the advice we need to give to our clients needs to be absolutely right, otherwise we could be sued. Or we're a soft drinks manufacturer. We can't experiment with the product that goes out the factory gate. Again, we'd be sued, or we might poison a consumer. But that mantra then of perfection in the end product starts to then crowd out any creativity and any possibility for experiment within the system, and makes it then very, very rigid and very brittle. So that moving to a mindset of treading gently, nudging the system, experimenting, and being prepared to get out of initiative if you find it's not working, when it has become someone's KPI, someone's project, someone's identity, is quite hard. But it's what leaders need to do if they're to navigate the complex space. Yeah, and then finally then cultivate resilience. Here we're both talking about in self. So how do you keep your head when all around you are losing theirs? And we might look at psychological resilience, we might look at physical resilience, and we might look at social resilience in the person themselves. But the role of the leader here is also to create systemic resilience as well. And we hear a lot about stress and well-being, and how corporate systems are in fact doing quite great damage to people if the expectation is that they're just going to run ever faster and ever harder to deliver ever diminishing returns. So cultivating resilience, as we've defined it here, is about you as an individual, but also looking after the resilience of the system.
So Mike, we've explained some of the underlying theory and thoughts that have gone behind this, the concepts of vertical development and the VUCA model and Cynefin. And that can start to sound a little bit complicated, but actually what you've done, I think, is, as I said earlier, drawn this out from a black art and made it very practical and very straightforward. And from the point of view of developing leaders, and I'm thinking about myself here to a certain extent as a coach, the point about this is actually what you're proposing is fairly easy to see, quite easy to understand, and you've got some fairly clear ideas about how one goes about developing people in a straightforward manner. Would you explain how this little screen explains that?
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. What this slide is really saying, I think when we first started exploring the ideas of adult development, of course, like many of us, I got religion and was quite evangelical about talking about adult development theory. And it is helpful to show the pathway for some people, and that can be developmental in and of itself. But if you think about the other type of work that we do, we don't start a workshop by explaining the psychological theory. So increasingly I've come round to the view that focusing people's attention on the habits and practices which are useful, have some utility for them in navigating the complexity that's before them is a much better start point. So we focus people on useful, simple practices and habits that can help them with their thinking, with their relating, how they manage themselves. And then if people deploy those habits and practices, over time, they might start to act their way into greater capability, and then maybe in time we might see a shift in their underlying operating system or their sense-making system. But I think it also plays to the point that we don't have the right actually to yank someone up by the hair and develop them in their sense-making system, but we can offer them some simple habits and practices which help them practically on the day job.
I think, Mike, we're going to, whoops, I've jumped one ahead. We're going to take another quick poll. Folks, there's the question on screen. I'm now going to launch the poll and just ask you to rate this question, if you don't mind. There is the poll. To what extent are your leaders blooming through today's VUCA environments? And I can see people scoring. Thank you very much.
I'm still there.
We're still getting a few more coming through. I think more or less stable there. I think I can close the poll. Right, and let's share the results. There we go.
So I guess that's probably one person, is it, Nick, that's not at all. So if that's your client or that's you, you really might be feeling you're in over your head, your glass is well and truly overflowing. But we've got sort of nearly half saying not much and 39% saying to a moderate degree. Some of you clearly are doing some great work and are feeling, yeah, we are thriving in these complex times. Got 11% at a significant amount, but most of us seem to be recognising the complexity out there, job one as I call it, isn't necessarily being matched by the growing capability of our individuals, our leaders, our teams to match that complexity. So job 2 is failing to keep up with job 1. Now the good news with an adult development message is that none of us are fixed. We can create a bigger vessel. We can upgrade the smartphone to meet that challenge that's before us. So this is a message of hope rather than one of gloom and doom, and that we're all going to hell in a handcart.
I'm pretty excited by this result, because I'm pleased to see this to a moderate degree. Nearly 40% of the audience feel they're working to a moderate degree. If you add the significant amount, that's 50% are doing stuff, which suggests to me that this is not in the box of too difficult to do, but people are getting it out and saying, yes, we need to tackle this, and are starting to make some progress. So that's really encouraging and exciting. So we're going to come back to our case study, and we're going to now sort of use the case study and one of the characters that we mentioned earlier, Josie, just to look a little bit at how we might use the tool to help people like in our audience, make some progress with their leaders on these subjects.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Nick. So this is loosely based on a live client who will remain nameless. The presenting issue why the client came to us in the first instance was they were anticipating, they knew that the sugar tax was coming in, and that was going to completely destroy the margin on their product, and different, whatever we think about the rights and wrongs of sugar tax and obesity, that was going to blow their business model. They've also coming under increased pressure from consumers, society, about recycling and plastics, and therefore packaging, and they've had a large shock to the system from both of those factors. So they could see that their business model was being disrupted, and this is a internationally recognised brand, very successful. Facing new entrants from other competitors and a shifting consumer trends, habits as well, and dreaded Brexit there as well, affecting things like supply chain, workforce, etc. So a lot of disruption that this client was facing. So
we're able to, we've modelled basically for you an example of one of the characters from earlier on who fits with this case study using the VUCA Capabilities 360. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about it, and Mike will add any points he wants. We're looking in the 360 at the 5 capabilities we've already introduced to you. There's only 62 questions, so it's a comparatively concise, easy to complete and quite quick questionnaire to complete, which is always important, we find, from our users. There are space for people to add verbatim comments and open text comments. It allows the framework that we use, and we'll show a little bit of this, allows us to show individual highlights and hidden strengths. These are the things that they rate themselves lower on, but other people rate them higher on. And it also shows lowlights, things they don't put energy or focus on, or habits that they're not using very visibly to other people, and perhaps sometimes where they rate themselves higher in areas than other people. So our structure of report enables us to do all of that. And then we've got this really useful section at the back, which is 10 pages of habit-forming development suggestions that relate to those 5 capabilities. There's the rating scale that we've used. Interestingly, we've used a 6-point rating scale on this occasion, so there's no easy option of number 3 in the middle. You've got to decide, below or above that middle line. So here's an example result for Josie, and this is Josie's overall results against those 5 capability areas. It's color-coded, and as with all of our processes, her individual self-scores are the S's in the diamonds, and you'll see straight away that she's rated herself on average slightly lower than other people have rated her. So she's a little hard on herself, and that's quite a common pattern we see with people completing 360s, but the opposite is also true. We see people who rate themselves higher than other people rate them, and that just helps us understand a little bit about how to handle a 360 feedback discussion with the person. So her highest rated area was in surfacing dilemmas and then promoting inquiry, and her lowest area was in cultivating resilience. So that just gives us an overview, if you like, of Josie, and I'll ask Mike to comment on that. Well, if there's anything you want to say about that particular snapshot, Mike, or do you want to look at the individual highlights?
Well, at least it's differentiated between the capabilities. I'd be running maybe a hypothesis in inquiring and surfacing dilemmas. Maybe the thinking type capacities are stronger for Josie than the more social, emotional ones. If resilience and how she manages herself is comparatively lower, but let's have a look.
Let's have a look. So here we're looking just at the top 5 key individual questions or items, is the language we tend to use. So again, because of the colour coding we use, we can see clearly that we've got 2 orange, which I think is from
promoting
inquiry, and 2 greens, which is from surfacing dilemmas. So it's not surprising that the highest rated individual questions come from that. She's rated herself reasonably consistently with everybody else, which is also nice to see, and often happens in the highlights. And then we look on the right-hand side at the actual descriptions and start to see whether there's some kind of theme or story that might be emerging from that. So go ahead, Mike, let me put you on the spot and see whether you can kind of pull out a theme, maybe following on from what you said on the previous slide.
Yeah, so I mean, I said my hypothesis might be that her thinking, the cognitive or conceptual type capabilities might be exceeding more of the social emotional ones, and I think that the top 5 might bear that out there. So she asks challenging questions that transforms how others think, and maybe she's aware of her own beliefs and assumptions, pattern biases that sit behind some of those assertions, and therefore in her thinking she's quite agile, and that perhaps fits with a pattern that she can encourage others also to do a bit of perspective shifting, and she can hold some of these her own perspectives quite lightly and start to empathise with others, and maybe step back with a degree of detachment as well. And you've got there, she can see therefore both sides of an argument.
Let's have a look at the items that were rated most harshly or lowest for Josie.
Yeah, so I mean, we can see the red there, which is resilience. There's something about that incoming data, the social emotional data, does something to Josie. Now, this could, of course, be trait-based. This could be, good old-fashioned trait-based. In our view of the world, we might want to look at some of the underlying sense-making here. What is it about Josie's makeup that may be causing that? I might hypothesise here, borrowing a bit from Bob Keegan, that she is subject to the feedback from others, that she might have a slight perfectionist tendency. Her story is being authored by others, and that's why criticism and setbacks affect her more harshly.
I've worked a little bit in the insurance industry, and I've worked with some actuaries, and this wouldn't be a surprising profile for many actuaries.
Right, okay.
So at a high level, we've just kind of given you a little snapshot of sort of how the data is presented. So at this level, these are sort of just fleshing out some habits. Just take us through how this works, Mike.
Yeah, so we wanted I think the whole purpose for us wanting to share the ideas of adult development theory is not to keep them to ourselves, but if we're really going to help organisations and individuals and even humanity transform, we need to get the ideas out there. So in the report, we've given quite a lot of our development tips, which really can help people with a sense-making shift or a capability shift in the report for people to draw on. So there's a number of very simple, practical habits. These are summarised here that actually you can use as a coach to guide people through what could I actually do with this 360 data. So we're moving from diagnostic or assessment into some very clear development actions for the client to take away.
Yeah, there's another page there just to go. So you've got this in the slides when we send them out, but you'll also have the extended version of this in the back of the dummy VUCA report that we'll also send out. So you can have a look at these. And I think it Mike's saying, and I think that's really important and quite generous of MDV to be sharing these development tips, because that is a lot of the hard work that needs to be done, is using that type of thinking to support people with their development. Before we get on to this, I might just go back a slide before we do that. Mike, just talk a little bit with me for a moment just about when you enter a client organisation, and maybe you're supporting a professional, learning and development or HR professional within inside that organisation. How do you help them start the conversation in with their management? How do you help them get this conversation going?
So I really follow a similar flow that we've been through on today's webinar, to be honest, Nick, asking how is your business becoming more complex or more uncertain? And I find the Cynefin framework often can be quite useful. If you're running a workshop or even you're doing with an individual, just to think about the sort of challenges and issues that people are facing and where they fit on the Cynefin framework. If it's all simple and obvious, then great, you don't need this questionnaire. But if they're noticing we've got disagreement about what is even the problem, let alone even the solution, or some of the solutions we have been chucking at the problem are no longer working, and therefore they're in the complex, that starts to open up a space to say, do we need to do something different?
Do you find that there is a substantial gap, and the types of organisations that you may work with, between where we think leaders could potentially become or be that's more effective, and where they currently are at the moment? And how do you experience that? Is there different areas or different
I think
elements?
There's a significant gap. The issue at the moment is people are realising that there's a gap, but they don't know what to do about it. And I think that's where we come along and say, we've got a set of technologies, a set of habits and practices that can help you close that gap. If people just run ever faster, work ever harder to stand still, that's where we get burnout. We start to see leaders getting hired and fired with alacrity, because the traditional tools just aren't working for this more complex environment.
And some of the features that we've all kind of witnessed in the world around us at the moment, like the polarity that is getting into political systems, the popularization of politics are kind of counter to this, because they're often leading to, strongly held opinions shouted loudly as the way forward, rather than what we're proposing, which is a more collaborative type world, a world where we're respectful of other people's ideas and opinions, and we use that to enrich the ecosystem of understanding that we all have as we're trying to, as you certainly use, navigate your way through this VUCA world.
Yeah, and I think, if an issue is genuinely in the complex, of course, human beings don't like complexity, we want to simplify things. But in Cynefin terms, if we're shoving the issue from complexity into simplicity, we get Trump, build a wall. Is that going to solve global migration? No. Globalization, Brexit, shove it into a binary referendum. Is that going to solve it? No. Now, it's tricky, of course, for a leader to hold that complexity, because we're all under pressure to deliver short-term results. And that's where you get this idea of a polarity as well. We've got to deliver for today, but we need to deliver for tomorrow. We need both and solutions rather than either or solutions.
Thank you, Mike. If you're interested in some of the ideas that we've been sharing here, you want to go back to some of the source material, there's a link, and this will be in the slides when we send it to you, to MDV Consulting's website, and they've got 20 or 30 articles to download from their white paper section, and a lot of what we've been talking about is there, and various other useful pieces of information about vertical developments, etc. So please go along to their website and download those articles. And finally, what we're going to do is ask the first 5 people who send us an email to Talent Innovations, and please state what you found most useful about this conversation we've had with you today, and what also you found less relevant to you. Include your mailing address for snail mail, because this is a real book, not just an e-book, and we will send the first 5 of you a copy of this, quite interesting, well, very interesting book, Upgrade. Do you want to say anything about the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's packed with habits, practices, tips and tools. So there's a lot in here. I'm using it with our clients. Karen Ellis has been working with MDV for the last 5 years. She's a guru in the world of adult development. She's part of our research community. So yeah, I'm not on commission here. Well, we're giving them away, but I would certainly recommend this. And it's a digestible read for your typical business leader as well.
If you aren't one of the first 5, we'll send you back the Amazon link, okay? You can get it yourself. I think that's probably covered pretty much everything. We are going to be sending out a dummy copy of the VUCA report, so you can see that 360. Please also feel free to visit the Talent Innovations website and see the range of products and services that we use. Some of you, I'm sure, on this webinar will already be customers of both MDV and Talent Innovation, so you'll know what we're all about and the pride that we take in our 360s and the way that they're so easy and friendly to use. I think that's probably everything. We haven't asked for any questions, but if you have any further questions or you'd like further information from Mike or myself or Talent Innovations or MDV, then please use the emails that you've got, and we will make sure that we get back to you. Of course, we're quite keen to follow up on any interest that emerges from this. So from Mike.
Thank you very much. Well chaired, Nick. Perfectly on time.
Perfect. And thank you so much from myself and the team at Talent Innovations and MDV. We're wishing you a great rest of your day. Goodbye for now.
Thanks for joining us.